My name is Jacqui Braid. I'm a paramedic on Gabriola Island. I was the unit chief for 7 years, and yeah. So we had gone to a birthday party of my brother on February 28th, and that was when we heard about it, just the day after. So I think it would have been March 1st was when it was like, oh, okay, there's something major happening. We had tickets to a Cirque du Soleil show in May, and they got canceled very, very soon. And the feeling was that it was all going to be over in a couple of months, right? But that was the start of it. Really, March 1st was when it started affecting, work especially, and we had a few meetings with the doctors at the clinic, the firefighters, the fire chief. There was a lot of concern, and one of the first things that came out is that it was not really going to affect children right away, which was like a huge concern. Not that the elderly don't matter, but and just the way that it was droplets, and that was the way it was being transmitted. So that was the first thing that I did, is I tried to do as much research as I could on droplet transmission, and I sort of took that to the table. And so the doctors were there, and the fire chief and myself, and just sort of trying to get our facts straight, because there was a lot of fear at the very beginning. I think it was Alert Bay had a bit of an outbreak, and they had the provincial health officer come out. They had the First Nations Health Authority, and they actually met, and so our doctors and the social worker went and talked to them afterwards, just to find out what they did and how they handled it, because it was a fairly similar, not quite as isolated as us, but just to learn from them. And luckily we never did have an outbreak here before the vaccine, but there's a lot of fear. And I think that is a double-edged. I think in some ways it was easier for us, because we're such a secluded little island. Everybody just sort of hunkered down and didn't go anywhere. And I can imagine if you lived in a city in a high rise and stepping into that elevator and just having to go to the grocery store and meet people on the streets. I think we had it a little bit easier here. And even throughout the pandemic, I think, we were able to go out to our green spaces and go for walks, and you rarely run into people. But I think what you're talking about is the supply chain and all of that, and there was that fear, and that's what we were addressing. Like a representative from Gertie was there, and just the ferries. Like, were the ferries going to run? What would happen if they didn't run? So we would just run through each worst case scenario and then try to be prepared for that. And so there was different task groups. Food supply. Were we going to have enough? And what would we do? If something, if the ferry wasn't running, or were we going to get fuel? So all of these things were sort of, and Gabriel is really quite resilient when it comes to doing things on their own. They saw a need for a clinic and to get a doctor here, and so the community just got together and went, okay, how are we going to do this? And they're really good at working with other agencies like VHA but they're also really good at getting the ball rolling and doing things for themselves. So Yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged, I think in the beginning a lot of people weren't thinking so much that. I think they were just like hunkering down and, getting what they needed and then coming home and washing their groceries, right? So there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? BCEHS is always an infectious patient is an infectious patient. So we have had, we know it's called a code 9. It's an infectious patient, and we know how to, we know what PPE to wear and how to don it, how to doff it, and so basically that never changed. It was almost every call was a possible, infectious patient. And so it was, when you were going to a call, you had to get the gloves, the face shield, the N95, the gown, because you just didn't know if you were going into, and possibly COVID patient, and nobody had any protection against it. And so if you're wearing the full PPE, it's definitely known now that should protect you. And it does protect you if you don it properly. And so we were having to do that on every call, but you can imagine you roll up to a house and normally we're at the door within moments, right? But now we had to get all of this gear on. It takes time to put it all on. And we didn't want to take a lot of equipment in with us. And at first, both of us would go in and we would, the attendant would go in and try to figure out what they needed, and the other paramedic would hang back. So it made calls that much more difficult. And then, of course, you can imagine you're walking in and you've just got all this stuff on. And, if somebody has a broken arm, they're like, you don't need to do all that. But we did. And so, yeah, it made calls longer. And then there was the fear of the paramedics going in, right? And then possibly taking that back to their own families, right? So if you're on a shift, and I remember the first one that I went on, and there's something called a influenza type illness. So somebody has flu type symptoms, runny nose, cough, cold. So that's an influenza-like illness. And especially with COVID, it was, like nobody really knew what the COVID symptoms were at that point, but they knew it was like a flu type thing. And so, you go in and you get donned up, and you just hope that this PPE is going to keep you safe. And there was also are you going to take that patient now to the hospital and perhaps infect other people? So, you really had to ascertain how sick are they. And we have a very, a really good resource. It's called a paramedic specialist that we phone, and we talk to a higher ranking paramedic. And they bring up your call, and they know where you are and what you're kind of dealing with, and then you can sort of you can run things by them. So we were able to do that. Also, the doctors here, which was, we sometimes have doctors on call for us, and they wanted to keep that clinic open for the non-COVID type patients, right? And they wanted it to be a safe place for somebody that did, if they cut their finger and needed stitches, they wanted them to go there. So the on-call doctors made themselves available 24/7 Yeah, it was quite incredible for any non-influenza type illness. We did not take any COVID patients to the clinic. That was understood that we would go straight through to the hospital so that we weren't infecting another crew and another car, because as you know, we usually take a patient over because we're the only ambulance on Gabriola. We do the transfer in the parking lot, but that would be exposing another crew and and the patient and everybody to another. And then the cleanup after the call was also pretty intense. So we would contact the hospital and go straight through to the hospital with a person who was potentially COVID. And then the hospital had another whole series that they were doing at that point. So it was a very involved kind of, and a lot of fear, because there just wasn't, people just didn't know exactly how bad it was, and how, I think we knew how transmittable it was. So there was this protection with the PPE, but it definitely made the call longer, and it definitely added complexities to the call. Oh yeah, well at that point we were an on-call station. Now we're a regular part-time station. So we have had like a number of paramedics down. I've only had it once. But the station level, so BCEHS developed, and that's in my notes there, is the Emergency Operations Center. And they did this during the wildfires. So the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, that was a group of managers. They just went into the EOC center, and they developed things like our station had, where nobody was allowed in. Paramedics didn't go in unless they absolutely had to. There was a clean zone where you took all your boots off, you washed your hands, then you went into the clean zone. We stayed away from each other, and that was all implemented very early on. And I think so. They were pretty concerned about keeping their staff as COVID-free as possible. And so, you'd wear the PPE, and then after a call, you would just, the station was a clean area, and nobody was allowed to come in from outside, no workers, no anything like that. There was notices on the door, and and so, and I think that as unit chief, I was implementing all of these things at the station level, and I had about 12 paramedics working at that point. And these practice updates, not only within the station, but also on calls, we would do a doorway assessment to really ascertain whether that person had any influenza-like illness. We would be, there was just certain things that we couldn't use, oxygen. The first responders the firefighters were not coming to every call, because we didn't want 6 firefighters all showing up at the door like they normally do. So that was the Firefighters Association said, no, you're gonna limit, you're only going to go to our purple or orange calls, or red or purple, I think is which are the serious calls. They weren't going to all just the yellow, sniffly calls. So all of these practice changes had to be, you had to let the crews know what was happening, and that was my job. I had to, and people. What I found is that the crews were they were concerned, and I have never seen people learn so fast or so quickly, because they were paying attention, because it was important, and they wanted to know what to do on a call, how to do it exactly properly, and what the protocol was if you did go through with a patient, what was happening at the hospital, right? And BCHS actually, I think people learn in all sorts of different ways, but there was like YouTube videos that they would just go, here, watch this, because some people really learn that way. And there's, a lot of times they would just send out an email, and if there's a major practice up change or a change, we get we get a course on it, and it's an online course, and then you have to fill it in, and they give you lots of time, and it was like, learn this learn this now, and people were paying attention and wanted to learn, so that made my job easier, because there was, and it was a lot of information about COVID-19, right? Which I think they appreciated knowing, and they could take that home to their families. No, about a 2-month period, there was like 70 practice up changes to the way that we would maybe normally do things. And yeah, they were fast and furious, and most of them made sense. Some of them had been things around infectious. We've always had the same PPE. I think one of the ones that I disliked the most was there was personal protective equipment was scarce, and there was a scarcity of N95 masks, and especially in the bigger centers where you're going through one N95 for every patient, and there's 10, 12 calls a day. So they were concerned about that. They brought out, I think it was in July of 2020, is the half mask respirators. And it was a huge initiative. They had to, another paramedic and I went down to Victoria, got the training on it, and they issued each paramedic in BC ambulance a half mask respirator. And it took the place of the N95 mask. And it was far more protective, but it was so much harder to work in. It was, you looked a bit like Darth Vader going in, and you can imagine a little 88-year-old woman who, is a bit hard of hearing. And I think a lot of elderly people, almost lip read. You convey so much with your face and through touch. And that was gone. I think that was the hardest thing for me, was to go in and try to comfort somebody, and you're just in all of this gear. It took away a level of communication that was pretty tough. And those half masks, it was difficult to communicate, even to dispatch. So on your radio, you had to hold them. It was really quite, yeah. It was, but you couldn't take it off, right? No, I think the biggest thing was that it is such a nice place to ride out a pandemic, right? And this community really came together. There was also, I think it was the second week in March, and this was just very spontaneous. The firefighters, the police, the ambulance, we just wanted to put a shout out to like the ferry workers and the grocery store workers and the pharmacy. All those people that went to work when it was just, our job, we had the proper PPE, and they were out there sort of, keeping our supply chain going. So there's a great picture up at the station, and it was we started, of course, the doctors were all still doing everything in the clinic. The clinic was open, but we drove around and we just went down to the ferry and we came up to the post office and the pharmacy and the grocery store and the co-op, and we just blew our horns and our sirens, and then there's this great shot down on the helipad, and the doctors all came out, and yeah, it was pretty nice. And I think a lot of people were like, oh my God, what is going on? There's like ambulances, police, fire trucks, and then it was like, no, it's just a happy sort of, And the start, I think most people will be, fairly proud of the community, because I mean, everybody really there was a lot of fear out there, and I think people could have panicked, but I saw a lot of neighbors helping neighbors, the ones that weren't so scared to go out. They'd go and get groceries, and people just stood up in so many ways. The grocery store started delivering. People for a Healthy Community, they were really like reaching out to elderly that were maybe a bit scared, and I think this, as always, this community just sort of pulled together, and the work that the collaborative did as well was pretty outstanding. They just when it hits, they just stick together and they figure things out. So I think I'm pretty happy at this community. And then I think people began to realize that, we've got it probably much easier than than a lot of communities, where it was harder to sort of stay apart and be careful. I would like to put a shout out to all the doctors at the Gabriela Medical Clinic, because they were so supportive of not only the paramedics, but staying open 24/7 for this community. They did that, and that was at a huge cost, when I know that they were scared too. So, yeah.